next video is Dr. Chelsea Sommer of Florida International University, who's going to bring us up to date on what the research has to tell us about the use of vocabulary tests to identify a language disorder, and also the current research on what are the appropriate strategies and tools that we should be using when we evaluate a student to identify a language disorder.
Hello, my name is Chelsea Sommer, and I am an assistant professor at Florida International University and a bilingual speech-language pathologist at Nicholas Children's Hospital here in Miami, Florida. I also help to teach part of the bilingual extension at Teachers College Columbia University in New York. Today, I will be discussing issues with vocabulary tests and ethical considerations moving forward. So when we're assessing for language, we want to make sure that we're actually assessing for language. And this goes back to the idea of validity. Is the test measuring what we want it to measure, or is it measuring something else? When we're testing for just using vocabulary tests, that's not a natural linguistic experience. It's just solely accounting for the number of words the child has. And labeling in itself is a very mainstream culture task. From birth, children are taught body parts, shapes, numbers, colors, and to label in books, what is this, what is that? But some children don't have those same experiences. So is it functional what we're doing? A study by Pena and Quinn in 1997 looked at Head Start programs, specifically looking at African American children and children from Puerto Rican backgrounds. They found that children did better on familiar tasks such as functionality. So what do you use a stove for? Why might you do this, or why might you use that? As opposed to a traditional vocabulary test that relied on labeling, such as the expressive one-word picture vocabulary test. Familiar tasks were better at distinguishing between children with low language skills and children who had typical language. Socioeconomic status has also been associated with language processing differences. A longitudinal study by Ferdinand and colleagues in 2012 studied infants from 18 to 24 months of age. The results at 18 months of age show that when compared to peers from their high SES group, children from the low SES group had smaller vocabularies and had slower language processing efficiency. These results persisted until 24 months of age, where children had smaller vocabularies, and there was also a 6-month gap for language processing skills for the children from the lower SES group. There are also biases towards socioeconomic status and bilingualism. The Self for Spanish over-identified low-income Spanish-English bilinguals. There was an incorrect over-identification of a language disorder that occurred for 1 out of every 3 Latino children from a low SES group. Therefore, 1 out of 3 typically developing children were identified as having a language disorder when they did not have a language disorder. This might be due to the fact that they were from a low SES group or that they were bilingual. We cannot say for sure. However, we do know that we should not use this test for English-Spanish bilingual children or children from a low SES group. Do not use scores with children from a low SES population and for dual language learners. We must use converging evidence and different approaches to assess for language. Moving on, and more evidence that there are biases towards socioeconomic status in vocabulary testing. A study by Horton, Ickard, and Weismer in 2007 wanted to assess the effect of socioeconomic status on lexical skills in African American children. The study looked at 30 African American children, 15 from a low SES group and 15 from a middle SES group. They looked at standardized vocabulary tests, the number of different words from language samples, as well as a fast mapping task for word learning. The results show that receptive and expressive standardized test scores were lower for toddlers from low SES backgrounds than for toddlers from a middle SES background. Children from low socioeconomic background had fewer words from their language sample than their peers from the middle SES group. However, there were no differences in fast mapping. So the children from both socioeconomic groups did similarly on a fast mapping task. And this is like a novel word learning task. So teaching a child a new word and seeing their ability to learn that new word and to recall that new word. So this measure was not biased towards socioeconomic status. In conclusion, socioeconomic status does influence performance on vocabulary testing, but fast mapping, such as novel word learning tasks, are not biased. There are different ways we can account for vocabulary, although they are not perfect and they do not hit sensitivity and specificity measures. I did want to mention them. So we can use total scoring, and that's where we account for a child's vocabulary in one language and another language and add it together. And there's also conceptual scoring. So the child, if they don't answer correctly in one language, they're allowed to respond in the other language, and they get credit for having that concept. A study comparing at total scoring versus conceptual scoring on kids from 22 months of age to 30 months of age found that using conceptual scoring alone resulted in smaller vocabulary. And they found that by using a total scoring approach in which they gave the CDI in both languages, in English and in Spanish, and added up both of those languages, using that total vocabulary identified the same proportion of bilingual children below the 25th percentile on monolingual norms as the CDI did for monolingual children. So this is a really important finding because, again, bilingualism does not cause disorder, and the prevalence figures for bilinguals and monolinguals should be the same. So they found that using total scoring in this early intervention population was most related to monolingual norms. When looking at older children and vocabulary assessment measures, they found that conceptual scoring conceptual scoring across different test administration time points actually resulted in higher scores and the best classification. However, if we actually look at this article and look into the sensitivity and the specificity, although that was, resulted in the highest scores and the best classification, the sensitivity and the specificity is still unacceptable. Therefore, labeling tests in general and vocabulary tests are going to over-identify children with a language disorder potentially. So what can we do moving forward based on all of this evidence-based practice and research that we've shared today? So do not rely on a test score. We know that these tests are psychometrically flawed and they do not hit our validity and reliability standards that are necessary. If you have not had experience looking at test reviews and the psychometric properties of a test, I encourage you to look at the test manuals and also look at the test reviews that can be found on leadersproject.org. Several authors and researchers, such as Castilla Earls and colleagues in 2020, suggested that we could use multiple pieces of assessment data to come together and trend in the same direction to make a diagnostic decision. So these researchers suggested collecting language experience questionnaires, a bilingual language sample analysis, an evaluation of learning potential, such as dynamic assessment measures, as well as standardized testing. However, we do know that the most commonly used standardized tests in our field fail to meet those psychometric standards, as I said earlier. And again, we must know how to judge and analyze the psychometric properties of these measures. This does not mean that we should jump to another test. This means that we need to assess the manual and assess the psychometric properties of that test. Thank you so much for all your time.
This video and a number of others showing our change makers will go together to form an online course available at leadersproject.org that will also be offered for ASHA CEUs. It will be free, and you will meet your ethical and culturally responsive requirements.